From the year 1981 to 2001, the global poverty rate stagnated at an alarming 69%, holding steady for 2 decades. But in the 20 years that followed, the world witnessed a remarkable decline, with the rate dropping to 46%. And in 2021, China declared a complete victory in its fight against extreme poverty, transforming the lives of nearly 100 million rural residents within just 8 years. However, on a global scale, the picture remains stark. The United Nations warns that by 2030, the goal of eradicating extreme poverty will fall short, with nearly 600 million people expected to still survive on less than $2.15 a day.
We will initiate the establishment of the Global Alliance to combat hunger and poverty.
Amid these sobering realities, this year's G20 summit in Brazil offered a glimmer of hope with the launch of the Global Alliance to combat hunger and poverty.
Poverty alleviation has always been a priority and a major task I'm determined to deliver. If China can make it, other developing countries can make it too.
Will this new initiative be enough to bridge the gap and bring the UN 2030 agenda back within reach? And perhaps most critically, what lessons can the world learn from China's progress in poverty reduction? In today's episode, we dive deep into the enduring challenge of global poverty with my colleague Yang Chengxi from Rio de Janeiro. It's Wednesday, November 20th. Last year, there were still 700 million people that lived in extreme poverty. And Chengxi, what is it like to live under $2.15 on a daily basis?
For the past few days, I've been traveling in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I witnessed firsthand some of the living conditions in the city's favelas. Now, favelas are the local term for urban slums, shanty towns that are home to some 16 million Brazilians across the country. We see these favelas up the hills in Rio almost everywhere. A lot of the city's poorest population live in these areas. And interestingly, these areas are where many of Brazil's biggest football stars come from, like Neymar and Jesus Gabriel. So a lot of these people live in relative poverty, and some of them even live in extreme poverty. And what I witnessed is that a lot of the buildings there are illegally built. They build their homes themselves. They connect their electricity to the city's main grid, so they don't pay for the electricity. But that is an arrangement that the city has made peace with. So a lot of the regular citizens in regular parts of town kind of need to pay extra money for the electricity to make up for the electricity that's been taken by all these favela residents. So a lot of special arrangements have been made to accommodate this situation of poverty within the city itself. So the direct spillover consequences of such poverty is that a lot of the favelas are run by drug gangs. Police usually cannot or will find it very difficult to enter these favelas to fulfill their law enforcement duties. Basically, drug gangs run these communities, and violence is very prevalent. I think if the poverty issue is not addressed, this will happen everywhere. The illegal economy will take over, and the community will be run by drug and violence, and that is not something that we want to see.
That really paints a very vivid picture of how the living condition is for the people living there. But at the same time, there are international big football stars rising from this area. So it's kind of like the movie Slumdog Millionaire, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. I mean, there is a saying that football and music are the ways out for children from the favelas. So these favelas are not only the home of football stars, but the origination of samba music that define Brazilian music. So a lot of these kids in these communities, they don't really have much of an opportunity to better their life except to really train hard to become like a football star or become a good musician. That will become their tickets to a higher social order, to walk out of the favela, figuratively. And I did interview several of the football kids over the past few days, and their sentiment is very passionate and sometimes very strong. One of the kids, he just burst into tears, like automatically, saying that he will make it one day. He will become a football star one day to help his family. And that was a very touching moment for me, because I could see that the sentiment is so strong, and it kind of also allude to some of the desperation of living in poverty, in the limitation of their opportunities to make a better living.
And getting into sport, playing football is the only way, or seems like the only way out for many of the people from there. And
It seems like so.
right, so sounds like poverty is quite a serious issue in Brazil, and that's perhaps why the president initiated this alliance to fight against poverty. But sure, we'll get to that topic later. This question I have, it may sound a bit apathetic. There are people that feel sympathy towards those struggling with their financials. Some give clothes, some donate money. But apart from sympathy, how does the global poverty problem matter to the other roughly 50% of the world's population?
Some of the people would really see it as like a poor country problem or a poor problem. But personally, I would see it as an everyone problem.
Right.
First of all, even if you're not living in poverty, even if you're relatively well off, helping the poor is first and foremost a moral issue. It is an issue about the good thing, the right thing to do. Let's get this out of the way. That is the first priority principle.
The Good Samaritans.
And also, yes. And then solving poverty for the rest of the world, actually, if you think of it in a very utilitarian way, it also brings a lot of benefits. It reduces crime. It reduces social discontent that will fuel negative social events that would make a society more chaotic and less orderly. If programs are effectively enforced to lift the welfare of some of the poorest populations, these people, instead of trying to make a living under the poverty line, will become better consumer, will become a better workforce. And that will help the economy grow better, and that would benefit everyone. And that has been a challenge for many poorer countries. If they do not have a sufficient number of competent workforce who are not struggling with their basic living and have money to consume, they would speed up their process of achieving industrialization by a substantial amount. And that would matter to the relatively well-off parts of their country, and they would greatly benefit from poverty alleviation as well.
The UN estimated that the 2030 target for eradicating extreme poverty may not be achieved. But now, with this establishment of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty during the G20 summit, could this alliance help close this gap or even bring this target within reach?
The 2030 target for eradicating extreme poverty, well, may not be achieved, I think, because of many factors, right? For example, the pandemic causing the world to shut down, causing relatively economic recessions and inflation everywhere in many countries across the world. And these are all contributing factors to the difficulty of eradicating extreme poverty. So when the world basically shut down for 2-3 years, it is an important moment now for countries to open to international cooperation, deeper international cooperation once again. So I think this is the idea behind this global alliance against poverty and hunger and poverty, even though each country has their own unique problems in addressing poverty issues. But that also helps each countries generate their own very distinctive experience. Some worked, some didn't, but those that worked could be valuable to other countries. Under this alliance, countries are encouraged to share their different experiences in terms of addressing this poverty problem. And I think this is what the idea is about behind this alliance.
Right. So each member can bring in their own experiences.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about our country. Since the beginning of China reform and opening up, there were nearly 800 million people being lifted out of poverty in China, which had contributed 70% of the world's poverty reduction during that period. So are there any experiences from China that can possibly be replicated elsewhere?
Well, I'll give you an example. Now, before I came to Brazil, I went to a relatively lesser known county in China's southwestern region called Rongjiang. Now,
Okay, football.
it's gone viral in 2023 because of live streaming of their amateur football matches. You've probably heard of it. It's called
Right.
春操.
That's right.
And it's become very popular. And some of the kids in these communities have been sponsored by a Chinese NGO to come to Rio to have a friendship match, which I filmed some days before, and it was an amazing match.
Wow. So they were in Rio de Janeiro for the G20 summit.
Yes, as part of like a youth exchange program
Okay.
to really have a football match between them and some Brazilian kids to broaden their horizon, to let the kids from both countries play with each other. And that is a very meaningful thing to do. But let's focus on Rongjiang here. Now, Rongjiang has been a relatively poor county in China. We all know that China eradicated absolute poverty by 2020. So Rongjiang has lifted its poverty designation only in 2020, the last year of poverty eradication. So it's been a relatively underprivileged area.
One of the
in
last
China.
ones.
Yes, one of the last ones. So I went there and saw firsthand what China's approach is in lifting these people out of poverty. I think the first signature is infrastructure building. So I went to the community of one of the football kids in an underprivileged area. So some of the residents told me that the area would flood every year, used to flood every year when the rainy season comes. And that's had been like a normal part of life for them. But in recent years, the government had enacted a project to lift the riverbanks in a nearby river so the floods never came back. And also, since Rongjiang became viral in 2023 for the football live streams,
Right.
a lot of the football pitches have been renovated to have better artificial grass, to become bigger so that the kids could pursue their dreams. So a lot of these infrastructure projects are aimed to make people's living condition better and give kids a better environment to grow up in. And this infrastructure building is really the cornerstone of China's efforts in transforming the less developed regions.
Okay, so this village, Rongjiang, really does have a lot of similarity to the favelas in Brazil, as football seems to be a way out for them, seems to be a ticket for them to a better life in the future. China obviously has a lot of experiences in dealing and handling poverty in the country. And has there been any cooperation in the past between China and another country in reducing poverty there?
Well, yes. First of all, I believe poverty alleviation is, first of all, a domestic issue for many countries. But at the same time, China, through many of its international projects, also worked to help partner countries in addressing their poverty issues. For example, the China-initiated Belt and Road Initiative, which cooperates with a host of countries in building infrastructure. For example, train lines, power stations, ports. These projects, in an indirect way, help people walk out of poverty. For example, BRI projects, all these infrastructure projects need to hire labor. Apart from the management professionals that Chinese companies brought from China, a lot of the other workforce come from
The local
the local
communities.
population. Yes, for example, on the Africa continent, about 85% of the workforce across these Chinese BRI companies are localized.
Right.
And also, their projects would require local suppliers of, for example, raw materials, engineering solutions. So these projects not only hire people, but they also create employment across the entire supply chain and industry chain. So this creates a very positive cycle of economic development that we hopefully will see gradually materialize in the coming years. So according to a research by the World Bank, it estimates that if all the communications and transportation infrastructures under the Belt and Road initiatives are finalized, then by 2030, they will create 1.6 trillion US dollars of profit revenue each year. And that accounts for about 1.3% of the global economy if they're all materialized. So that would translate to the fact that from 2015 to 2030, about 7.6 million people will get rid of absolute poverty because of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that is a very indirect way, but a very substantial way that China contributes to poverty alleviation across the world.
During the summit, President Xi put forward 8 initiatives to support global development and the modernization in many developing countries. What are the highlights from these 8 initiatives from President Xi, and how will they impact the UN 2030 target for the remaining 5 or 6 years?
Great question. I've been following the G20 summit for the past few days, and what I get from the President Xi's speech and his highlights of 8 initiatives is that China is aiming to empower the global South countries, the developing countries, which makes up about half of G20 already. And Brazil's Lula administration is also a proponent of empowering and giving a bigger voice to global South countries. And that I think there is a good synchronization there. And among these 8 action plans, we can see that there is a focus on the Belt and Road Initiative, which we just discussed, can create positive changes in partnering countries, and also a focus on developing the African continent, which has been a lesser developed region in the world, and also a focus on poverty alleviation and food security. So these are all very important issues in the global South countries, and that makes up most of the 8 initiatives, empowering the least developing countries, or LDCs. And these messages tie in very nicely to a previous G20 summit in Hangzhou in 2016 in China, where 2 documents were issued, one on sustainable development, which poor countries are usually the biggest victims of, and the other from the China G20 summit was industrialization of Africa and LDCs, least developed countries. So I think this G20 summit in Rio really carry forward this line of thinking, giving more power to the global South countries, which is very important as we discuss when poverty issues and development issues in these countries are addressed, it will create immense positive benefits for not just these countries, but across the world. And that really gives a nice push to the UN 2030 goal.
So very consistent focus during the G20 summits from Hangzhou all the way to Rio de Janeiro this year. And of course, to achieve the UN target in eradicating poverty, there are things to do as well as things not to do. And President Xi pointed out that this prosperity and stability around the world will not be achieved with rich people becoming richer. And also there should be fewer, I'm quoting, courtyards with high fences. How do you interpret that?
Now, this is my personal understanding, but it is a well-accepted consensus among many global economists that unbridled market economy, if not managed well, could enlarge the wealth gap, which will literally make rich people becoming richer. And that is why governments across the world, policymakers across the world, will need to play a role to enact policies to make the wealth distribution from the market economy more equitable. Now, that by no means mean market economy is bad. Market is a great force to lift productivity and welfare across the board.
Right.
So that is why China has been a strong proponent on free trade. So this year, China has reiterated its stance against unilateralism and against protectionism, which is a proponent of free trade. And that is economy 101, because free trade make everyone better off, so that every country can focus on their special attributes and resources and to realize a maximum level of positive growth. And we've seen over the past decades the fruit of this globalized collaboration in industry. Although it creates a lot of challenges in terms of equity, and that's why we've seen some pushbacks against it in the past few years in some countries. But China's stance is always try to make it more just through international collaboration, through dialogue and consultation, and not unilaterally rejecting it or taking measures unilaterally through sanctions and tariffs that are aimed to punish partner countries. That, although look like a political game by some countries, ultimately, at the end of the day, it would be bad for the normal folks in all target countries and in the countries that initiates these attacks.
But without a doubt, the resolution of this global problem will take efforts, but more importantly, time to see if these efforts will take effect. Thank you very much for speaking with us, Chengxi.
Thank you.
I thought President Xi's address at the G20 was absolutely terrific. It's easy to say that poverty alleviation is the most important priority, but resources...
Just before I came to Brazil, I met a Chinese team that were participating in clean energy. So providing people and training them with skills on clean energy. And that is one way of empowering the community. They're even trying to train them on solar.
Now I just hear in his speech, he's have a comment to solve the poor countries and poor people. Also through the Silk Road, that China built it now. It will cross so many countries, so many cities around the world. When China focused to help this community to improving their economy, that will help.
As the Chinese president highlighted at the G20 summit, from Hangzhou to Rio, leaders have shared a common vision of a just world built on the foundation of a shared development. China's success in eliminating extreme poverty offers a beacon of hope and a potential blueprint for addressing poverty worldwide. But the challenge lies in translating these strategies to diverse global contexts, where the complexities of poverty are as varied as the communities they affect. As we move forward, the world will be watching closely, hoping that the lessons from China, combined with the renewed commitment of the Global Alliance to combat hunger and poverty, will pave the way toward a future where prosperity knows no borders. That brings us to the end of this episode of Deep Dive. This episode is brought to you by me, Yang Chengxi, and my colleagues Zhang and Qizhi. Special thanks to CGTN reporter Yang Chengxi. I'll see you in the next one.